I am very excited about underwater sound, and it gives me great pleasure to be able to talk about it for a while to a semi-captive audience. So just a bit about myself. When I was a graduate student, I'd finished my master's on a totally different topic, and I was starting to work for my PhD. And a new faculty member came into the department, and I'll never forget, he said, "Guess what, everybody?" Everybody being all the graduate students who were like little ducklings, looking at this guy. He said, "Fish make sounds." You know what it's like when you meet somebody and you know right away you want to see this person again? Well, that's what happened to me. And for a good part of my life, I've had this love affair with the topic of underwater sound. And the reason is not that I'm a physicist, but that fishes that I love, I've loved the ocean since I was about 7, I think, or earlier. Fishes can make sounds, and the whole possibility or probability that they can communicate, not quite a language, but what you might call a meta-language, emotional states, by use of sound, just had me absolutely hooked, and it stayed that way. Having said all that, these fish, these are little damselfish, and they make sounds also, but I used them, or I watched them for a completely different reason. It had to do with sex change in fishes, which is another research area of mine. Fishes being the only vertebrate class that change sex routinely. I don't mean all of them do, but the point is it's not, what's the word? I can't remember. I think teratogenic. But the point, it's not the result of a disease process. It's quite natural. And in this particular species, they'll go from female to male. But that's a totally separate, wonderful thing. So getting back to sound, what I want to do today is, my area is animal behavior and ecology. And it's in that context that I've studied fishes. But what I want to do today is first introduce a very small amount about the history of sound, and then move on to the kinds of sounds that are made and the characteristics of sound that make it important in the ocean, or in fact in any aquatic medium, whether it be freshwater, brackish, or marine. And after that, well, not only sounds of fishes, but also sounds of what we call abiotic origin. And you'll see what that is. The term means non-living, so you might be able to imagine things like surf. Okay, but take it from there, just keep on going, and you'll get an idea. And then the last part of the talk, after that, the sense of hearing and why that's important. And then I'm going to move into underwater noise pollution. And this is a topic that is extremely serious. It's something that everyone should know more about. But because out of sight is out of mind, right? Out of hearing is also out of mind. And it's extremely important that when we think about Kinder Morgan and Enbridge and the rest of it, it's not just oil spills that's a problem. Problem is the world is getting noisier, and this is affecting fishes as well as marine mammals. Oh, and my last introductory point is I'm not going to be talking at all about marine mammals for a couple of reasons. The big one being most of you have heard some marine mammal sounds, and with only 40 or 45 minutes, I'd rather concentrate on these other topics which are less well known. Okay, so here we go. Banging on the bottom of your boat to attract fish is something that's been done, before Christ was born. And Greek fishermen did a lot of this. Aristotle knew about it and actually wondered whether fishes could hear other things, whether they were at all interested in sounds. But the real study of underwater bioacoustics didn't start until World War II, starting very roughly in 1939. On both coasts, the Americans in particular wanted to watch for enemy submarines. On the East Coast from Germany, on the West Coast from Japan. And hydrophones, which are underwater microphones, were put down by the U.S. Navy, hydrophone arrays, which just means several in one place, and underwater cameras in order to determine, can we see this, can we hear it, can we not only hear the sounds but identify them. However, what they heard was a little different. The first sound is from an invertebrate, actually snapping shrimp, and these in fact are found worldwide around coastlines. And the sounds they make, well, now you'll hear it. It doesn't sound loud now, but around the world, it sounds like hot fat frying in a pan, and it's extremely loud. And that was one of the sounds that the Navy people heard, sonar operators heard, when they tried to listen for submarines. Come on. The next sound, and these were all around the same time, was the sound of Atlantic croakers. And you can see from what I have written, forming large groups every evening and vocalizing for several hours is not just done by croakers, it's done by lots of fishes. So let's listen to this one. Now, if you happen to be living in a houseboat, this creates problems because the fish start in the evening at about dusk, and they'll continue for several hours. And so if you have a baby, or if this is true for several of these fish, or anybody who wants to get some sleep, it gets kind of difficult. And croakers were found on both the East Coast and the West Coast. The next, which sounds very similar, is called a weak fish. There's nothing weak about it, I assure you. Yeah. Now that second sound resembles the sound of the next fish I will play you, this one. And this is the one that sounds like a pneumatic drill tearing up pavement. And if you imagine not just one in the confines of a nice room, but imagine hundreds of each of these. And they're all trying for one thing, and that's to attract mates.
Male initiates spawning, 1922.
It's obviously not my research, but usually it's the males that make noises, but not always. And what's happening here, and it's really important that you keep this in mind, is that these are groups of animals that are trying to attract mates. And if their sounds are masked, right, by louder sounds within the same frequency ranges, then mate attraction is going to be a whole lot less efficient. Sea urchins also make noises, and it's kind of eerie when you think of sea urchins as acoustics, but what they're doing is scraping algae off rocks or chomping on the stipes, that's the stems of algae, with their teeth. The whole feeding apparatus of a sea urchin is sort of toothy structures. And the sound imagine thousands of these moving over a habitat. It's pretty Stephen King stuff. But one of the important things I've tried to put in here is that the sea urchin calls or sounds and the snapping shrimp sounds and the others can be important sources of biological information for animals that are actually traveling, that are looking, say, for spawning grounds, for feeding grounds. Sea otters can hear these urchins, and sea otters love to eat sea urchins. And so when you hear a sound, don't just think, oh, that's cool. Think, this is useful, right? And what's it useful for? Other animals that are looking for feeding grounds, or that might be trying to escape from something, or that might be looking for mates, right? Okay. Once the Navy people heard what was going on, they started developing filters. And we use those filters today. I mean, every time we're using speakers for a stereo or on a computer, the filters filter out certain frequencies and allow others to pass through. And that's what the Navy had to do in order to finally hear the sounds of ships. And World War II was a huge impetus, a huge kick in the butt to developing and learning more about underwater sound. And the U.S. Navy, with all its deep pockets, was primarily responsible for this kind of thing. So what I thought I'd play you now, just to show you that the ocean really, truly is not silent, are non-animal sounds. These are the abiotic or non-living sounds. And you're going to hear earthquakes, not the volcanoes. I don't have one of that. and the rest you can read. So let's start out with earthquakes. It's also important to note, and this is really important, that just like the very low frequency sounds of whales, anything that is relatively low frequency can often be heard thousands of miles away. And there's good evidence by now that a number of whales can communicate across ocean basins. And what you're going to hear are earthquake sounds that were recorded thousands of kilometers away. How fish respond, we don't have a clue. This is the result of seafloor movement. The next one, a black smoker vent. Okay, hydrothermal vents are cracks in the sea floor in which very hot material from the mantle comes up through that crack and reaches the ocean surface. And the water is above boiling. I mean, it's super hot. And it also contains a lot of minerals. And when that hot liquid hits the cold water of the ocean, the minerals precipitate out, and often they make dark colors. And this is why these are called black smokers. There's also white smokers where what precipitates out is a white color. But anyway, this material is extraordinarily hot. And these are colonies of tube worms, which don't have digestive glands. They don't have digestive organs as we do, but that's a separate topic. And this is simply the recording device, the hydrophone, okay? And this particular one is right off our shores. It's one of the reasons I chose it. It's part of the Juan de Fuca Ridge. This is where seafloor spreading is occurring. And on it goes forever. There we go. Iceberg collisions. These are really interesting because when ice meets ice, or if one berg meets another, or if a berg meets an ice shelf, you'd expect a cracking noise. But to my own astonishment, when I found these, when I learned about these, what you get instead, and I'm not really able to explain the reason, I don't understand it well enough myself, is called an iceberg song. So where you have the berg hitting the shelf and rotating, this is what the primary sound is like. So if we look at sounds generally, what are their major identifying features? Well, they can be divided into three categories: frequency, amplitude, which means loudness or intensity, and temporal pattern, which means pattern over time. So frequency is pitch. And for any of you who play piano or who play a guitar, say concert A on a piano, when an orchestra is tuning up, is 440 cycles per second or 440 hertz. What we tend to do is use the frequency scale that matches human hearing. So the first category, infrasound, is lower than 20 hertz, 20 cycles per second, because sound is a pressure wave. The second is the audible range. Somebody who is young and healthy can hear from 20 hertz, I'll call them hertz, to 20,000 hertz, which abbreviates as 20 kilohertz. That's what the K is for. And then ultrasound is above that. Our dogs can hear above that. We can't. That's why it's called ultra. Okay? So that's greater than 20,000 hertz. That's pretty high. And as we get older, and we tend to lose some hearing, what we lose first are the highs. Anyway, the second category is amplitude or intensity. And if I talk very softly and then I start to talk louder, that's called amplitude modulation. I'm modulating the loudness of the sound. And fish do that very well. So one of the fish I studied would growl very softly like a dog until I did if I was doing something it didn't like. If I kept doing that, the growl would get louder and eventually, wham. So they're signals. And the third, Oh, one thing I forgot to mention is frequency modulation. We hear that a lot more with marine mammals than we do with fishes, but I'm not gonna. I just wanted to add that. And the third, and to me one of the most interesting, is pattern of the sound over time. So you're going to hear that in a couple of the fish that you'll be listening to. The best example, I think, is it's called the black drum, but you'll hear. Anyway, temporal pattern, you can have a continuous hum or you can have it broken up. And if it's broken up, it can be broken up into regular bits or into irregular bits, kind of like a Morse code. Why is sound so useful to aquatic animals? Well, sound is the universal alerting sense. There are no naturally deaf animals found. You can have fish that are, no naturally deaf fishes or marine mammals. You can have animals that are naturally blind, but not naturally deaf. Sound moves 4 to 5 times faster in water than it does in air, which makes it phenomenally good for instant communication. And it travels much further without fading. We call that a lack of attenuation, especially at the low frequencies. And remember that, it's really important both for noise pollution, sounds made by fishes, which are primarily low frequency, and sounds of shipping. Light independent. Sounds can be used at night or in murky waters, and no matter how good, I'm a diver, I was, no matter how good the visibility is, it's not that good. And I remember on the Great Barrier Reef, which is where I did a fair amount of research, lucky me, going down into what was like an enormous blue room. And the walls were fish and would appear through it and disappear again. It was, I don't have the words. But sound travels much further. And as I said, sound is faster to send and receive than olfactory signals. So let's get into the nuts and bolts here. Many fish make deliberate sounds. In other words, these aren't just because they bump into something or because they're feeding. Courtship and spawning, usually but not always, made by males seeking females. But does anybody here have an aquarium with croaking gourami in it? Croaking gourami are very common aquarium fish. And guess who starts courtship? The female. And guess how she starts it? With noises. So, there's a number of females that do make sounds. Aggression. For a whole variety of reasons, which I've put down here. It can be anything from defending eggs to defending a feeding territory. And as I've said, most fish sounds are low frequency. So those are the two major reasons or major causes of sound production. And they're made in two ways. The swimbladder is mainly a buoyancy organ, so that if a fish is looking at you, say in the aquarium, it doesn't have to constantly keep itself up. It can simply trim its buoyancy and hang there and look at you. But the swimbladder also acts as a drum for specialized sound muscles, and it amplifies sounds that the fish makes by grinding its teeth. That's what stridulation is. Teeth in the throat or in the jaws, or it can even be spines. So here we go. Plainfin midshipman is one of the commonest fish on our coast. It's intertidal, and the males, in this case they are males, have 3 kinds of noises. The first is to call females. Now I want you to imagine too that if you're in a houseboat, this might not be what you want to hear. That's it. You get that all night long. It starts and dusk and it continues. And you get hundreds of males all doing that at the same time. And here you are in your houseboat or on your sailboat, and sound goes into the hull of the boat. And oh boy, you can hear it too. Exciting. So this is one of the kinds of sounds that we made. The second sound that the males make, I should say the males dig in the sand and they make a nest. And they start making noises, the hums, to attract the females. But when they are starting establishing a nest, they also try to drive away other males. And they make growls. I can play that one again if you'd like. But when they are guarding eggs, they make a completely different sound, and it's a grunt. So can you see why temporal patterning is really important? You get everything from a continuous hum to this, growls, which are fairly irregular, to the grunts, which are like that. The next fish, oyster toadfish, is found not on this coast, but on the east coast. And what you're going to hear is a chorus. This is more than one. By the way, the oyster toadfish and the midshipman are related. They're in the same family. So if we listen to this, what you're going to hear is a chorus of males, and each one is effectively saying, choose me, because the females kind of, hang out. Let's see. Am I interested in this one and this one and so forth? And then we have my personal particular favorite. And again, the energy is below about 800 hertz, so it's what we consider low frequency. Both sexes can make sounds. I've got to do that one again. I love it so. These fish are huge. They weigh over 100 pounds. And so their sounds are quite loud, not obviously here, but they can be quite loud, and they can penetrate. Now, I said that the Swimbladder was useful both with sonic muscles and to amplify other sounds. And fish, a lot of fish have teeth in the back of the throat. We call those pharyngeal teeth. And pharyngeal teeth can be rubbed together. And when they are, the Swimbladder amplifies the sounds, and this is what it's like. Can you hear that those are really rough and raspy? They're not tones the way all the others were. Now, fish also make incidental sounds. These are not deliberate. These are sounds, for instance, if I happen to be around the corner and I'm chewing potato chips, somebody is going to hear me and will kind of, maybe will you share, or maybe where did you get those, okay? And fish are the same way. In fact, a lot of animals are. You hear somebody else feeding and you kind of, what do you have? So, feeding sounds. Now, the problem with feeding sounds is that they will they won't just attract curious animals, they'll attract competitors and predators. Another kind is hydrodynamic, and I don't have a recording of this, but if you have a school of fish, just like a school of birds, a flock of birds, when they make sudden changes in direction, or a sudden change in velocity going from high to low, for example, you get a sound. And I just don't happen to have a recording of that. But there's feeding, and then there's also herring farts. Now, I'll play the feeding sounds first, and then we'll go to the others. Parrotfish are really good at this. And note the beak on a parrotfish. That's why they're called parrotfish. The beak is really teeth that have been fused together. And parrotfish eat coral. There's a lot of animals, a lot of fishes that eat hard material, but the coral is probably the best example here. And these are sounds that a diver can hear. Yum. And if you're diving and you happen to be in a beautiful coral glade, think that a lot of the sand that you're swimming over came out the rear end of parrotfish. Right. And then we come to Pacific herring. Now, I did a paper, a research project as a consultant at one point for fisheries and oceans about the way herring respond to the sounds of the fishing fleet. And I'm here to say herring are smart animals. We recorded a whole bunch of sounds on the grounds, on the fishing grounds, And a lot of the fish boats cooperated with us, which was just great. And then played those sounds back to herring that were captive in net pens off Nanaimo. And that happens to be near where the ferries dock. When the ferries came in, the fish in the net pens did not change their behavior. They did not show any kind of startle, any kind of avoidance, nothing. And I interpreted that as habituation. You get used to it, right? The way we all get used to a too noisy world, increasingly noisy world, until something happens. So I showed you the photo of the swimbladder connected to the gut. Herring form schools, and at night, those schools come closer to the surface. And if you can't see somebody at night, right, you can still use sounds to communicate, even if those sounds are not deliberate. The swimbladder, I said, was first a buoyancy organ, and by adding gas and releasing gas, you can trim where you are in the water, right? Very much like a submarine with blowing its tanks, or which means getting rid of the air so it goes down, or filling its tanks so it goes up. And the sounds you're about to hear were, alas, not recorded by me. We got recordings of them, but we didn't interpret where they were coming from. Other people did that a bunch of years later. That's a herring fart. And the people who did record this got the Ig Nobel Prize for it, which was pretty cool. So you imagine a whole lot of fish in the darkness if they are listening. They are listening because they can't see, and olfaction isn't very good for communication. It takes forever. If I were wearing perfume, you wouldn't smell it in the back of the room until at least a couple of hours later, I think. So these incidental sounds can be used as part of what we call a soundscape. And the soundscape is basically the world, the sonic world, the acoustic world around you. Just as right now, there's a visual scape, right? The room, the lighting, where people are, things like that. But I can't emphasize enough how important the soundscape is for animals living underwater. I talked about the main characteristics of sound, which were frequency, amplitude, and temporal patterning. But let's look at that again in the context of soundscape. In other words, how do animals, fishes, or marine mammals get their information? One way is variations in frequency, in amplitude, in how long the sound lasts for, and also in the pulse patterning. A second is, when is the sound produced? So it could be day, night, dusk and dawn. A lot of spawning aggregations occur at dusk and dawn. And it could be the season. So spring is a wonderful time to record sounds. Winter, not so much, if you're thinking about either feeding or spawning. Biological context. Feeding, you've heard, courtship and spawning, and defense. And finally, where the sound originates. If it's abiotic, say it's surf, an animal will learn to avoid that. If the sound originates in a particular, maybe protected area, it might be a spawning ground to which the same animals come year after year. That's terrifically important. And if those sounds are relatively low frequency, they are in danger from our own noises. Before I get into that, I want to talk a bit about hearing. What I found, and it was amazing, was that the fish, the herring, could tell if a ship was approaching or departing or staying still. It could tell if it was approaching, departing, staying still, and the speed, so that if I am, say, that chair maybe is a school of herring, and I'm the ship and I'm walking toward it like this, the herring will sink in the water, but slowly. If the ship is coming rapidly, the dive will be almost immediate, right? They were able to tell so many things. They didn't bother with the small ships. It was the big ships. And the reason was twofold. One is the major frequencies, and I know I'm saying this again and again, but the major frequencies that the big ships put out are low frequencies. And the second part is that they are really loud. Whereas if you get something like, I don't know, a jet ski, it's a pain in the butt, yes, and, fish respond, they like to leave, but it's not that wham, it's not that terrified response that you get to a big thing that produces very loud and very low frequency sounds. So the herring knew. And what we didn't only find that they responded to large ships more than small, to approaching ships rather than departing ships. We found that what they didn't like, what they startled to, was what you might call rapid onset. So that if a ship is stationary and then it starts its engines, try starting your car, right? Bam! So that's what we call rapid onset, and you get a startle. But the fish aren't about to waste energy. If that loud noise continues and stays in one place, the fish don't seem to care. If, on the other hand, the ship starts to move, what's happening? The amplitude's increasing, right? Now let's say I'm the herring and the ship's coming toward me and the sound gets louder and louder and louder. What am I going to do? I'm going to dive. Rapidly? No. But if it gets louder in a hurry, yes. Okay? So, I came back a convert. I came back from the field, a total convert, and I was talking to everybody about how cool these fish are, and not one person, everybody said, yes, very nice, dear, I got very frustrated. Anyway, herring, the reason I'm mentioning herring is that I was doing some contract work for fisheries and oceans at the time. I'm an academic, but I'm also, I do consulting work and outreach work, and it's all wonderful. And what fisheries wanted me to do, as I said, was find out how herring respond to the sounds of the fishing fleet. And since then, so much has been learned about herring, and it's always been known that they are a keystone species in the coastal food web. And I'm mentioning this and sort of staying on it for a bit because it's so tremendously important with respect to Kinder Morgan and Enbridge and LNG and the fact that we are making the underwater world a much noisier place, and we are effectively in danger of driving animals away. And if we move herring away, if we drive them away, a lot of animals that depend on them as a food source, not us, we don't depend on herring as a food source, right? But a lot of whales do, a lot of salmon do, right? Forget about the roe fishery and just think about the food web. It's like cutting it off in the middle. So let's go back to soundscape. Just as our visual or landscape changes depending on where we go, right? The soundscape changes depending on where we go and where the fishes go. So if we think about fishes that have fixed migration patterns, each year they go to the same feeding grounds, here at this time of the year, there at another time of the year. Do you see what I mean? Spawning grounds at certain times of the year. They get used to that. And if anything happens to change it, there's a period of what you might call bewilderment. So learn the local soundscape. Detect prey, like being able to detect the sea urchins, or for that matter, herring by their farts. We have no idea of how a lot of these things are detected, but those are possibilities. Avoid predators. The sounds of killer whales, echolocating sounds of killer whales. Some fish can hear that, and they will take steps to avoid. Find feeding and spawning grounds. Find places to settle. This is something which, had we heard this 15 years ago, nobody would believe it. But typically when, so you got to start from the beginning here. If you have a group of fish, let's just say you have a community of fish in one place, their babies had better not settle right where their parents are, because too much space will be used up. It's just evolutionarily not the greatest idea. You want to have a distribution. You want to have dispersion. It's the same with trees and seeds. Seeds that settle in the shade of the parent plants may not do as well. So often, most of the time, I should say, The eggs of fishes develop into larvae. In other words, when the eggs hatch, the larval form is what emerges, which may or may not look like the adult form. Invertebrates, just the same. And in invertebrates, a larval crab looks nothing like the adult. Adult crabs they deserve respect. But the babies are adorable. They really are. They're these funny-looking little things with spines and two huge black eyes. They're just beautiful crab larvae. Anyway, crab larvae become adults when they settle to the bottom, right? And the same is true for barnacles, for a whole lot of animals, and even fishes need to find areas where, even if they're not going to settle down in the middle of a really dense patch of their own species, they should be nearby. Because if their own species happen to reside nearby, then that was probably a good place for them. And so even the babies can hear. We have no idea how. And more amazing still is that the larvae of barnacles and of crabs and of coral polyps themselves, right? Here they are swimming in the plankton, or I should say drifting in the plankton, and there comes a point when they have to go down to the bottom to make an adult life. And how they do that, it's been shown now that coral polyps for sure, some fish larvae, barnacle larvae can all use sound as part of finding home, which it's astonishing. Nobody would have believed it. So the soundscape is useful not just for adults and finding geographic features such as coastlines and reefs. And a lot of that may be done by hearing surf patterns, but not all. So how do fishes hear? Hair cells like ours and otoliths, which are also called ear bones, are located in the inner ear. Now, we don't have the ear bones. Fish do, and if you are lucky enough to get the head of a big fish, and you know what you're doing, crack open the parts of the skeleton, the parts of the skull that hold the ears, the inner ear, and take out the ear bones, wash them, just plain water, and dry them, and get a very fine jeweler's drill, and drill a hole through one end, and you can use them as earrings. I don't have them though today. I wore haddock earrings for years because my PhD was on haddock acoustics. And I just thought they were gorgeous. And after a while, I changed. Anyway, okay, so fish lack an external ear. If you have ears, it's kind of hard to be streamlined and swim, right? They don't need a middle ear, but they do have the inner ear. The spiral cochlea is a bony structure on which there are many hair cells. It's a way of increasing the number of hair cells in the inner ear, which are what pick up frequencies, right? But in fish, there isn't a spiral cochlea. Most fish don't need to hear the whole range that we hear. One of the very important things, and in fact, this looks like just, a statement, but it's tremendously important for research. And the reason is, if structure, innervation, and basic operation are the same in most vertebrates, then what holds for birds may hold true for fishes. And at the very least, what holds true for birds, say with respect to noise pollution and how birds avoid certain areas or make their songs louder in an urban setting, that kind of thing, it's a legitimate research question to ask about fishes. And if you think of the precautionary principle, the idea is if you're not sure, leave it alone, right? Don't be like a drunken monkey trying to mend a watch. And fishes can determine a sound's location, but how they do this is really under investigation. The human ear isn't best suited for hearing underwater. And when Cousteau wrote his book, The Silent World, he was on scuba. And when you're on scuba, your own bubbles, they deafen you. And you're not supposed to hold your breath underwater, right? And any of you who dive, the top 33 feet are the most dangerous because between the surface and 33 feet down, the atmospheric pressure doubles. You do not want to hold your breath in that area. You don't want to hold your breath at all. But if you do, for a very brief amount of time, you can hear sounds. I've heard whale sounds underwater. I've heard fish sounds. When I studied the damselfish I showed you in the title slide, the male of a group Well, I took a couple of students down with me, and each of us was at a different place watching these fish interacting on coral. And the males were kind of like this with me, if you don't mind my using you as a subject for just a minute. They were like this, and then, you get away from us. And that's how they'd sound. I can't do it right. It was like a beautiful trill. And so the fish would go, and then, turn around and go back, and all the females behind them would be going. It was hysterical. Once, at least, I was laughing to the point where I nearly lost my regulator and was, in danger of having to go up to the surface, which I didn't want. The only thing I want to say about the previous slide is that the Swimbladder makes, if you have a big Swimbladder close to your ears, it acts like an amplifier, and you can hear a lot better. So, underwater noise pollution. This, I'm going to play you wind turbines, pile driving, air guns, sonar, and vessels. And again, these noises, especially if they're below 1 kilohertz or 1,000 hertz, can mask sounds that are biologically important. So even if you can hear beautifully, if another sound, an alien sound, comes in and masks what you're listening to because it's in the same frequency range, right, then you're SOL. What are you going to do? And it might be the biggest problem today for fishes and marine mammals. I was a commenter for the National Energy Board on its review. I was one of over 1,000 commenters. We're allowed to write letters, and I wrote them a 12-page document, which is part of the public record, they all are, on why dirty oil is a bad idea from the point of view of tanker traffic, because that was my specialty, right? Underwater sound. And I was involved in the Kinder Morgan comment thing, not Enbridge, that was up north. They didn't want people like me. But the problem, and I will tell you now, with part of the problem with the National Energy Board process is that, sure, people like me, scientists and non-scientists, but people who are informed, can write eloquent letters with a lot of information. I had 3 pages of bibliography plus websites for the letter, for the document. But all that NEB had to do was look at it and file it in the public record. Right. If you, as a member of the public, don't know what's in the public record, or don't even know that sound could matter, right, you're not going to look. So it's a really cheap way, in my opinion, of not informing the public. And it's one of the reasons that the process is broken. And I said out of sight is out of mind, and out of hearing is out of mind. So I'd like to play you now a couple of the sounds. By the way, what I plan to do with the letter, I've brought it up to date because that was 3 months ago. And I'm sending it to my MP, MLAs, NGOs, and anybody, a couple of reporters. What else can you do? And I'm not the only one doing this. Yeah. I did. I put the link out, but what I want to do is on my Facebook page, I want to put the link, or a link if I can. I'm not quite sure how to do it because the edited version is not on the public record, and I had to bring it up to date. But what I can do certainly is say, if you're interested, contact me. And I'll be happy to provide you with an attachment. So, sorry, I get very angry with this kind of stuff because it's so sneaky. It's so bloody backdoor. And if you're underwater and you hear a boat, you just want to curse because the sound it's wicked. Okay, let's start with wind turbines. Everybody thinks wind energy, fine. And yes, it's better than LNG or dirty oil or burning any form of carbon, but I'm going to play you 2 turbine sounds. General frequency lower than 700 hertz. This is the other one. pile driving. There's two kinds of pile driving. I'm only talking about one here, the kind that's most harmful. Although there are two, one is called, impact pile driving, and that's the first one. And the second one is vibratory pile driving, but I won't be talking about. It's impact pile driving that the sound is not going to be very loud, but they really are loud. And because they're what we call impulsive, meaning rapid onset, they can cause damage. Now, it's not been found yet, if ever, whether they cause a problem for fishes, but they certainly do for marine mammals. And by the way, if you're interested in the effects of anthropogenic, that's human-made sounds on marine mammals, contact me. I will be happy to direct you to, his name is Christopher Clark, and he's a marine mammal scientist who specializes in this sort of thing. It doesn't sound like much, but I want you to think of that amplified. And then the second sound is that. Major frequencies, less than 500 hertz. Seismic noise. Air guns are used to shoot sound through the substrate, in other words, through the bottom. And this is a way of determining what the bottom's made of and what's under the bottom. Geologists use this to prospect for oil. But what's important here is the air guns may have been operating off Sable Island, but they were recorded thousands of kilometers away. The mid-Atlantic ridge, both oceans, well, you know, our planet is anything but stable. And the mid-Atlantic rift and ridge is where the ocean bottom plates are colliding, right? And along the ridge, you can get vents, you can get black smokers, white smokers, and colonies of animals, deep sea animals, which live on bacteria. And ships will, you know, passing here can hear sounds of air guns on Sable Island, which is off the coast of Nova Scotia, not very far. So this to me is an incredible eerie sound. And here's an engineer. Whoops, sorry about that. Yeah, this is the size of the air gun. It's not very big, but oh my. 1 a second. Thing is, a lot of this is now coming to light because of the dirty oil, because of the increase in tanker traffic, because the Salish Sea is going to be very, very, very noisy if Kinder Morgan has its way. Sonar. Sonar stands for sound navigation and ranging. And there are two forms, active and passive. In active sonar, a sound is literally sent out, and the echo is what's listened to. So the operator listens for echoes, and this is how run silent, run deep, you know, all sorts of stuff like that. Listening for ships is usually done. You send out a pulse of sound, and then you listen for the echo. That's the kind I'm going to play because the other kind is silent. It's called passive sonar, in which all you're doing is listening. You're not sending out any echoes. This is stealth. Should have put the word stealth on there. And the thing about active sonar is that it's extremely loud, but the frequencies are fairly high. And so many fish have been examined to find out whether they are damaged or affected in any way by sonar, and they do not seem to be. It surprised everybody because, I mean, when I was going through learning about all this, we assumed, and should never assume, but we did assume that sonar was so loud that because we didn't like it, the fish wouldn't like it either. Well, the fish don't really care a whole lot so far about that relatively high frequency sonar. For all I know, they can't hear it. But marine mammals, that's a different story. And the last one I'm going to play is shipping noise. And one of the things to keep in mind is that a sound that's loud may mean that the object is close to you, or that it's even louder, way off in a distance, and what you're getting is relatively soft. But a sound that is soft might simply be because that sound is far away. So listen to the characteristics of the sound. Don't pay too much attention to just how loud it is. Having said that, but most importantly, they emit broadband sounds that can mask most of the noises that fish are interested in, or for that matter, marine mammals. And this is what's tremendously important and very urgent now, because if Kinder Morgan has its way, you know, Trudeau has put a moratorium on an increase in tanker traffic in the north, but not down here. And okay, we can't stop our use of fossil fuels like this, but to increase tanker traffic is not a great idea. And if you know this information, you have knowledge is power, right? And if you want to object, if you want to write your MP, if you want to write the National Energy Board, if you want to write the newspapers, this is a really important thing to keep in mind, that the broadband sounds will be hugely loud if these super tankers keep being built. And they really are super tankers. They're larger by far than anything we have ever seen. So here we go, having said all. Imagine that most of the day, at times, several ships at a time, moving through shipping lanes. A lot of the noise comes from the propeller. Merchant vessel. You'd expect that would be softer because it's a smaller ship. But there's something else that people should be aware of, and that is ship design. The big ships, the propeller is exposed to the outside. And in a big ship, furthermore, the hull is very large. It's the amount of the ship that's below the water is huge because it's a big ship. A tug is small. And in a tug, the propeller is recessed. So the sounds made by the prop are nowhere near as loud. And it's not just a matter of the small size of the ship, it's also where the propeller is placed. And one of the things that people have learned is that cavitation, which means the formation and the bursting of bubbles, is the major source of sound, of anthropogenic sound anyway, and of iceberg and of glacial sounds, glacial melt. Would you believe that one of the problems, and this has nothing to do with us, when glaciers melt, and I wasn't able to bring the sounds in, this is brand new stuff, and I think it was discovered last year, and it just was on the news about a month ago or 2 months ago. When the bubbles burst in when glaciers start to melt, bubbles form and collapse, and millions and millions of bubbles, and the sounds are louder, according to the researchers, than any kind of sound they've ever heard. And in glaciarized, they call them fjords, in Norway, in Alaska, these are also areas where a lot of animals congregate to find food. And a problem is that as the glaciers melt, these areas get noisier and noisier and noisier. And the fear is that the animals will avoid them, because that's part of what animals do. So the consequences. Avoidance is common in a lot of animals. There's a problem with fishes in that they're underwater, they're small for the most part, and they're hellishly hard to track. Whether you use sonar or underwater TV or whatever, it's very hard to track. And all the sounds I played you were the results of so much effort, especially the sounds of the fishes. You know, it's so hard to identify. Here you are on a boat above water, right? and you're listening with the hydrophone over the side. What's making that noise? Well, you can lower down an underwater camera that's actually part of the hydrophone, next to it, coupled to it, and hope that you get a picture of the animal or animals involved. But it's not easy. And so all this research that I'm sharing with you is the result of years and years and years of effort and a lot of failures. So avoidance is common, and it may lower fitness. Now, fitness is a biological term, ecological term, and what it relates to is the possibility that you will survive and produce offspring, and that those offspring will at least survive to reproductive age. Okay? So how can fitness be lowered? Well, larval fishes may make mistakes in navigating toward the sites where they settle, in which case they die. Adult fishes and marine mammals, they may miss spawning or feeding grounds. And finally, even if they find them, if the noise is great enough, those areas may be abandoned. With herring, in order to find their spawning grounds in the Salish Sea, they have to come in from offshore feeding grounds, and to do that, they have to cross the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which is, okay, part of the Salish Sea, sorry. But the Strait of Juan de Fuca is major shipping lanes, and where there's going to be a fourfold increase in the number of tankers using those lanes, if Kinder Morgan has its way, who knows what the herring will do. The frequencies are right for them to avoid, right? And the sound is certainly loud enough. So using sounds to aid in conservation. Passive acoustic monitoring. Remember I talked about passive sonar? Well, that's kind of what this is. There's an array of hydrophones that simply records. And there are underwater TV cameras set up nearby, and they simply record. And it's non-invasive, it's non-destructive. Has anyone here heard of what was done for grizzly bears? When I heard about it, I just jumped up and down. It was so good. In order to determine whether animals, the grizzlies in this case, but it could be black bears, were using certain pathways more than others, the researchers set up a couple of strands of barbed wire between trees. And as the animals passed, some of the fur, some of the hair would be caught on the barbed wire. And then what do? You pick up the hair and you analyze the DNA. I mean, it's elegant and it's simple. And that's the same with this. So it's called passive acoustic monitoring. It's been called passive acoustic listening, PAL. And the University of Victoria has the Venus project. Look it up and you'll get wonderful information, far more than I know or that I can provide here. So the PAM is used for identifying essential habitat for marine protected areas, essential feeding grounds, essential spawning grounds, for that matter, essential shelter areas. Determine daily and seasonal activity patterns of a whole variety of animals. Okay? Possibly track population growth, although that's kind of dicey. It's a little hard to know just how that could be done accurately. And determine the source, sites, and extent of noise pollution. And if you want to learn more, my contact is there. Okay, I love these little fishes. They're just beautiful. Thank you.